Right. So far in this unit, we've mostly been talking about aquatic ecosystems. Now let's talk about something that's a little more terrestrial in nature, how we dispose of our solid waste, aka our trash or garbage. So, what is solid waste? It's any discarded material that's not liquid or gas, obviously, since it's a solid. This is generated by things like domestic activities, so from people's houses, industry, and agricultural activities, so crop waste or things like that. So if we look at this chart, it's showing you this pie chart, um, how much municipal solid waste, so city waste, was generated by different types of material in 2018. For some reason, I got this from the EPA website at the Environmental Protection Agency, and they didn't have any more recent data that I could find. It might be there, I might have had to dig farther, but for some reason they had this massive report in 2018. So a lot of these diagrams will come from that. So notice about 23% of the waste that was generated was paper and paperboard like cardboard. About 4.2% was glass. Then you had some metals, about 12% plastic, yard trimmings. This includes things like clipped grass, cut branches, things like that. Food waste was at 21%, wood 6.2%, rubber and leather 3.1%, textiles, that means clothing, at 5.8%, other and miscellaneous at about 1.5% each. Um, Non-hazardous solid waste is called municipal solid waste, and a lot of times it's going to be disposed of by your local city government. This includes items like food, paper, plastic, textiles, leather, wood, glass, metals, septic tank waste, which was something that was not on this diagram. That is for people who aren't connected to a city sewer system. They'll have a septic tank where the waste water from their house will sit and kind of decompose a little, and then they have to clear that out every so often. And then yard trimmings, like I talked about. There's also e-waste. E-waste is becoming a bigger and bigger proportion of our waste that we generate. It's any discarded electronic devices like televisions, cell phones, computers. Just think about how often you get a new cell phone or a new laptop or a new television, and think about what happens to the old one. A lot of times you throw it away, although now there are more and more options for recycling e-waste. So here is in 2020 what percentage of global e-waste was from each category. There was small things like irons, kettles, vacuum cleaners, large appliances like freezers, fridges, washing machines, heaters and AC systems, screens like PCs and TVs, and then small IT, that's mobile phones and laptops, and then lamps made up another 1% of that. The big worry from e-waste is one, there's a lot of stuff in e-waste like gold and cadmium, small amounts of these elements that are very valuable that would be very valuable to recover. And then also, if you leave e-waste in the same places where we dispose of our other trash, then it can leak some toxic elements into the environment. So here is a diagram, an infographic that I thought was particularly neat that talked about e-waste. So this is talking about global e-waste that's generated. So notice the biggest proportion by far comes from Asia. It makes sense. Asia is a physically largest chunk of land and contains the largest population. But that's followed by the Americas and then Europe. Africa is only producing a tiny proportion of e-waste right now, but as more like urbanization happens, this will probably grow. Oceania is like the Pacific Ocean, includes Australia and Pacific Islands, and that's a small part of population, so that's going to be a small contributor. There's been an increase every year in the amount of e-waste because we consume more things. This is e-waste in pounds per person. So you see Europe and Oceania actually produce a lot of e-waste per person. It's just Oceania has a much smaller population. Then there's about $57 billion worth of recoverable materials that could be recycled from e-waste. However, a lot of that is dumped or burned and not recovered. About 40% of heavy metals in landfills in the US come from discarded electronics, and there's a lot of e waste out there. So take a moment, pause this, read through this infographic. It's pretty cool bits of information. So, how do we dispose of our solid waste? Well, most of it ends up going into landfills. Then, if you see here, we have in this diagram, it's showing from 1960 to 2018 how we disposed of our solid waste. And the gray right here, the light gray, that's landfills. So, most of it has been going into landfills. We haven't really increased the amount going into landfills too much. Sorry, forgot to put my phone on silent. But there has been an increase in the amount of waste produced. This is for the United States. And we're taking care of that with some other methods. So you can incinerate your waste, which means burning it. This does reduce the volume that's going into landfill. So here, right here, this is incineration for energy production. So you can actually burn this waste at high temperatures, and some of it can be incinerated to produce electricity. There is a problem that it produces air pollution. Then food waste, yard trimmings, and paper can be composted. Some paper can be composted. And that's the yellow. And then the remainder of some of that paper, plastic, aluminum cans, glass, and some metals can be recycled. Notice recycling has exploded in popularity, though it is possible we'll get a chance to talk later about some of the problems with recycling. Turns out a lot of the stuff that's getting put into recycling may not actually be being recycled, which, if you're like me, makes you very sad. So, most of this stuff goes into a landfill, so let's talk about landfills. So, a landfill is a site to dispose of solid waste, and it's not just dumping out in the open. These things are built and designed to try and protect both the environment and people from any hazardous materials that can be either leaking out of waste or produced by the decomposition of waste. So these consist of there's some structures we'll talk about on the next slide, but in general, there's garbage which has been compacted or crushed down to take up less space, and that's layered with soil. So you'll have a few layers of garbage, layers of soil, layers of garbage, layers of soil, and that will go until you fill up the landfill. Also, this kind of stuff, construction and demolition waste from demolishing or tearing down buildings is often disposed of in landfills as well, even though that's not normally taken by city trash. Completely filled landfills are usually covered with an impermeable layer, which we'll talk about on the next slide, and they can be then covered with soil and used for parks or for building. So, what are the components of a landfill? You start out with an impermeable bottom liner made of plastic or clay. And the impermeable part is what's important because the purpose of this is to prevent chemicals from leaking out of a landfill into your groundwater supply. Then, one of the big goals of a landfill is to prevent water from getting in because then it goes through the layers of trash, picks up, and becomes contaminated by dangerous chemicals. And then, if that leaks out into the environment, that causes a lot of environmental issues. So, there's also often a stormwater collection system to try and prevent water from getting into the garbage. So, it'll collect water and kind of drain it away to other areas. That minimizes water infiltrating into the layers of garbage and the formation of this chemical called leachate, which is water that has picked up all sorts of contaminants. That leachate, no matter what you do, some water will still find a way into the garbage, and that ends up forming into this water mix called leachate. It's water that's infiltrated through the decomposing garbage and picked up any contaminants that can dissolve in water. So landfills will have a leachate collection system to collect that leachate and treat it so that way it doesn't contaminate groundwater. Then, once you have finished filling in the landfill, you've filled it to capacity, it's covered by a cap, which is an impermeable plastic or clay layer. Again, the impermeable is important because you are trying to make sure very little water percolates into the garbage. And then also, decomposing organic material like food waste will be broken down by anaerobic bacteria. Remember, anaerobic means no oxygen, and that produces methane as a byproduct. We'll talk a little more about methane in Unit 9 and how it's a very powerful greenhouse gas, but it can also be toxic as well if it's, in high concentrations. And so, modern landfills have a methane collection system to get that methane out of the landfill. And often it can be used for fuel, it can be used for biogas as well. So here is a diagram showing you a landfill. This is below the trash, so this is the bottom. You see that there are some leachate collection pipes. There is a layer of clay. There is a plastic liner. There's gravel there for drainage. There's also soil. And so there's a lot of layers between the actual garbage that's decomposing and the groundwater. You do not want to have anything going from the landfill into groundwater because that can be very harmful. Contaminates your water supplies. Similarly, on the top, once the landfill is completely full and closed, you'll have a clay layer on top, you'll have a plastic liner, you have gas collection to collect any methane, then you'll have soil, gravel, and drainage, all of that on top as well to cap it. You have a leachate collection system, which is going to collect that leachate so that way it can be treated. You have a methane collection system to collect methane that can be then used for fuel. And you will have monitoring systems in the area. So, one to monitor your groundwater to make sure it's not getting contaminated, and another to monitor your soil to make sure it's not getting contaminated either. But obviously, solid waste disposal is going to have some environmental consequences. So, let's talk about that. Landfills, if they aren't properly constructed or if something gets damaged, they can actually leak out contaminated leachate, which can get into the groundwater. That groundwater could potentially be someone's drinking water supply. And if you dig a well and directly get your water from that well, it's not going through a water treatment plant, so it's not being purified before it gets to you. Methane and other harmful gases can be released, especially if you don't have a methane collection system or if it's malfunctioning. By the way, older landfills didn't have a lot of these protective measures, and so those could also be leaking either methane or leachate. The decomposition of the trash is going to be affected by the composition of the trash, meaning what's in the trash. Is it mostly metal and plastic, or is it a lot of food waste? If it's a lot of food waste, obviously that's going to be producing a lot of methane. If it's a lot of plastic and metal, that stuff is not going to decompose very quickly. And it's also affected by the conditions that microbes need for decomposition. Um, the higher the temperature, the faster these guys will work and produce methane. The colder the temperature, the slower they'll work. And then if you take some of your trash and you incinerate it instead, that's going to cause air pollution. So there are environmental impacts when you use a landfill, environmental impacts when you don't use a landfill. And then, like I said, some toxic byproducts, lead, mercury, and cadmium are some toxic metals, can be released from e waste as well. Then there are some items that most landfills don't accept, and then people may end up disposing of them illegally just because they don't know how to dispose of them properly. And so, an example of this is what you see on the screen, which is rubber tires, which have to be disposed of in a certain way. And if you leave them in piles somewhere, they can collect water and become breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And obviously, there's no protective methods to protect the surrounding environment from leachate or methane production, and so all of those environmental consequences will be there as well. Then ocean dumping is a problem. I did look at a study that said several countries in Asia have a very big problem with ocean dumping, where they dump waste into the ocean, either accidentally because they don't have proper landfill facilities, and so where they dump the waste, it ends up getting carried away into the river, or other times because laws may not be strict enough about garbage disposal, and sometimes people are lazy and they will dispose of waste where they can, or they just don't have the facilities or the access. So, some of the countries that were indicated have a lot of island nations, and I don't know how easy it is to have trash service on those because you've got to pay to take that trash away. You probably don't have a lot of space for landfills, so you would have to pay to ship it somewhere else, and people can't afford that. Um, then this is contributing to the formation of those big oceanic garbage patches, like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch that we talked about with littering and its effect on the ocean. And then, just like with any other plastic waste, especially since that stuff doesn't decompose, wildlife can become entangled in it or ingest it. Another big problem is in a lot of areas where this waste is not disposed of properly, if they're high poverty areas, people will pick through the trash to find materials that they can get paid for recycling, and then they're exposed to all the toxic compounds that are in the trash. They might be like these gentlemen here in this picture are searching for recyclables that they can sell, and they're just, stepping in all of that polluted water. So that becomes a major human health hazard as well. When you don't dispose of trash properly, it can also cause disease outbreaks, especially if there's any organic waste in there and you have harmful bacteria breeding there. That can be a big problem as well. All right, so that is our lesson on solid waste disposal.